Welcome back, everybody. At this point, we've got a nice piece of gouge-shaped and profiled cane that we're preparing to form into a bassoon blank. So this is the last step of preparing the wood itself to become a bassoon reed, and at the end of this stage, what we'll have is a reed that is completely round, ready to fit on the end of a bocal, but is still sealed at the tip. So it'll be what we call a bassoon blank. It'll have all three wires on it and be ready for wrapping, but it will be essentially ready to be scraped and become a reed. So in order to do this next step, this is the portion of the reed making process that requires the most material as far as most tools and things like that. So I'm going to walk you through what I've got in front of me. I've got a piece of wet dry sandpaper. This happens to be 500 grit. Usually I keep 220, 660, and something around 400 or 500 in my box, just because they're all different grits. The wet dry is pretty important because we're going to be dealing with some wet materials, and if it's regular sandpaper and not wet dry specific, then what happens is that the sand that's on the paper actually comes off and gets all in your reeds and your mouth and in between your teeth, and it's just not a really great experience. So wet dry sandpaper, super important. I've got a flat diamond file. This is just out of a set of 6 that I bought online for about 10 bucks, I think. The flat one is the one I'll use today. This is a piece of cotton twine that I'm going to use to soak and make my little blank mummy. So cotton twine just from a craft store. Return to my trusty razor blade. You may use an X-Acto knife or something for this process as well. I just use a razor blade. This is what I'll refer to as an easel. You can get a bassoon-specific easel. This is what we'll use as a template or as a brace as we're doing some of this final preparation process. I use an inch diameter dowel rod, so it fits the curvature pretty well. We have bassoon mandrel. I don't use a forming mandrel, rather. I use a holding mandrel for both forming and just holding for general reed work. But some of you may have a forming mandrel, which looks a little more like this with the steeper taper that you would use in this first stage and then transfer over to the holding mandrel. When we get to the step of inserting the mandrel, I'll show you how I manage without the forming portion and why I do that. This is just a 6-inch metal ruler with both standard and metric measurements on there. You may find as you're speaking with different professionals or different teachers, different people throughout the bassoon community, that these measurements vary wildly as far as where we put wires and where we clip reeds and things like that. Over the years, I have developed a very specific but somewhat confusing collection of measurements that mixes standard and metric. So I like to make sure that I have access to something I can read both millimeters and inches on. Needle nose pliers with wire cutters in them. My go-to rule for students and anyone purchasing new reed equipment is that you should just buckle down and get yourself a fresh pair of pliers, nothing that's ever been used on a car or toilet. And then this is 22 gauge brass wire, which is a little more specific. Brass is very important with this due to the tensile strength of this. So if you go walk into a craft store and you find 22 gauge, but it's copper wire or something like that, then you might find that wire either it's too hard to pull, or you pull and it snaps. So 22 gauge brass wire is the thickness that I use for this. So we've got our gouge shaped and profiled cane, and the first step is to finish this last little cane process before it goes into soak. I don't soak nearly as long as most people that you'll speak to, but there are some ways that I kind of get around some of the dangers of that in my forming process, which I'll walk you through in a second. But this piece has only been soaking for just a few minutes while I got everything set up for this video. So the last steps of this process before this joins its partner in the water here is I need to define the collar. So the collar is the point on the reed where the bark stops and the blade begins, so where the tube stops and the blade begins, or if you're moving in the direction of the air, where the vibrating portion of the reed, which is the blade, becomes the resonating portion of the instrument. And we want that to be a really clear definition. So I take my straight razor blade and draw along that seam. Some profilers will do this really well for you, but I use the corner of my razor blade, just going the depth of the bark, defining where I want that ledge to be. It should be about as much if you drag the razor blade or if you drag your fingernail across where it gets stuck. You can hear it kind of catching on that little cut. So I've just gone right into the edge, and then I lay the razor blade flat against the blade and cut backwards. You can see those little bits that are peeling up. And what that does is forms a nice neat little ledge for the collar. So I peel that back. I'm being very careful not to lift too high on this angle. So not 90 degrees, not 45. It's really like as close to 0 as I can get, flat against the blade, because what that does is guarantees that I'm getting a parallel cut and just lifting the fibers off of the back third of the reed to clear this up, instead of digging in and getting deeper of a cut than I would want in that back third. So I've defined one side, flip it over, repeat. I'm using, again, the corner, drawing just enough to where the edge gets caught, flat against the blade, and then push the blade against the blade. And you can see this process, this approach that I use of pushing and then peeling up. It works like a sort of perforation. I can just peel these little edges up, and they brush right off. At this point, this is when I'll use the file, flush up against that, so now I have a nice neat little ledge to balance on. And just make sure that there's no bumps is all I'm doing here. I'm just clearing out this back. So I have a nice clear back third of the reed and a sharp definition where the tube begins. It's a nice straight line. I also want to go back to my razor blade here, and I'm going to do what's called scoring now, which is the process of putting, essentially this is more perforations, right? Putting straight lines through the bark of the cane, so that ultimately when I wrap this around the mandrel and I form the tube into a circular shape, the cane won't crack right up the center. So that's where it's most likely to crack, is right up the center. So I use a scoring method that skips that center line because the cane already wants to crack there. That's where the most tension is going to be. So I put 3 parallel cuts on either side of this. I start about where the second wire is going to be. Push through just the bark, just like we did with the scoring, or just like we did with the forming the collar rather, and then all the way through the cane, right at the very end. I had a teacher once that called this process confusing the cracks. That's the purpose of scoring, is to give the cane multiple options to distribute that pressure of being formed from a straight line into a round tube. We want it to evenly distribute so the cane breaks evenly. Start where the second wire is. Off center, I'm skipping that center 7th line, 3 on each side. So I end up with 6 scores in sets of 3 parallel lines. 1, 2, 3, skip the midline, 1, 2, 3. If this really bothers you not to have specific measurements for this, I can tell you that it should be in the ballpark of 18 millimeters up. That's where I'm going to put my second wire, is where I only find the need to score up that far. And they're about 1 millimeter apart. Imagine we're about 10 millimeters wide. So 1, 2, 3, skip the center, 1, 2, 3. Then the last step that I do is I'll take my sandpaper, place it on the easel, and I'm just going to buff out any imperfections or kind of extra cane fibers that are left over from maybe a soft cane going through a gouge process. I put this flush against the easel and sand the inside of the blade. Not too much, just enough so that it feels nice and smooth. And you can see, I usually gauge this just by sight, by how much cane there is kind of peeking around the edges. So if I can see a fine dust, then that's about all I need. And there's a pretty big difference if I feel how smooth the cane is on the side that I've done from the side that I haven't. Just nice and smooth. This is removing a softer cane from the inside, and it's going to leave me with a little bit, ever so slightly, a harder reed. Cane it was closer to the bark. So at this point, I've done defining the collar. I've scored, I've sanded the inside, and the reed goes in the water, or the cane goes in the water rather. I'm pretty much done with my sandpaper at this point. It's a minimal process. I'm also pretty much done with my easel. So I'm left with just these items. Usually when I put the cane in to soak in the water, I'll drop the thread down in there as well, because that's going to need to be wet for this next step in the process. This is also where I get the most water all over my hands. So I take the cane out of the water. You notice this was only maybe 10 minutes soaking. That's I call it flash soaking. It's a very short amount of time. I am more of the school of thought that I leave as much of that kind of natural sap in the reed. The more times you soak a reed, the more times you soak the cane, the cloudier the water gets, right? It's all the sap being extracted from that. And that does stabilize the cane. But the opposite, right, the other end of that continuum of stability is flexibility and sometimes vibrance, right? So I tend to leave quite a bit of sap in the cane and prioritize vibrance at this stage. And then if I need to adjust for stability down the line, then I do that. But a lot of people will disagree with me on that, but that's my reasoning for leaving that really vibrant sound in the reed itself. So at this point I find my midline, use my ruler, fold over the midline, and I'm just double checking to make sure that the collars line up. The collars line up. If the back ends don't, I'm not too concerned about that because I can trim that later. So I've got the reed folded in half. Take my wet piece of twine here, and this is where I make my little reed mummy. I start where the collar is, pull very, very tightly. We have found in my studio throughout the years that if you tend to have reeds that side slip, one of the places that can happen is as you're wrapping this twine, if you pull against the blades, then you can kind of imagine how that's creating a shearing force, pulling one blade against another. So I pull against the seam, pull tight this way, and then just wrap over the blade. So tightly. So I'm changing the amount of force that I'm pulling at any given moment. Wrap up about a third of the way up the reed, a third of the way up the blade, and then all the way down the tube. If I run out of tube and I have thread left, I keep on going all the way back up. And at this point I want the thread to be wet so I can pull it really tight, and I want to pull it very tightly. You can see I usually gauge if I'm pulling tight enough by the skin underneath my fingernails. It should be white from that amount of pressure, or it should be lighter than my normal skin tone, I suppose, from the amount of pressure that I'm pushing those together. At this point, if you're someone who uses a folding or a forming mandrel, this is why you use it, right? Because there's very little space there. It's very difficult to reliably get a larger mandrel in there. I use my pair of needle nose pliers and tease open that bottom. You notice I'm not going very far up because if I did this further up, it would certainly crack. So just opening the butt of the reed large enough to get the mandrel in. And I'm sure there are those of you screaming at home, you haven't beveled, you haven't beveled. I promise you I haven't forgotten it. I'm coming back to beveling. I do beveling a little later in the forming process than you may be used to. So I push. At this point, that creaking sound is acceptable, but I don't want to hear is a crack. So if I hear a creak, that means that my thread has been pulled tight. This is a really taut connection of those two blades, and so what that creaking sound that you're hearing is actually the metal sliding against the wet cane on the inside, which is okay. I'll go around once with my pliers right at the bottom, and then one plier width up to make sure that this bottom of the tube is a perfect circle. And I can check by looking along the seams here. I won't see a flush connection at the edges yet because I haven't beveled yet. If I'm tossing the word beveling around and it's unfamiliar to you, I'll be at that step in about 30 seconds. So at this stage, I unwrap that thread just enough to expose the bottom, well, maybe ½ inch or so of the tube. Grab one of my pieces of wire. These often come in very large spools. I just have pre-cut it and put it in my little Elvis tin here to about thumb length. That's how much I end up needing. Put my bottom wire on at 5 millimeters from the bottom. I've got a couple handouts on my website with all of these measurements and everything like that. If you aren't committing them to memory on the spot, that's totally fine. Short end comes up, so it's about 1/3 to one side, 2/3 to the other. Short end comes up, the long end comes around, and whichever wire goes on top first, so I put the long wire on top, that one just needs to stay on top all the way around. Wrap it around till it meets. Long wire still on top. I grab that with my pliers, keep the long wire on top, twist it so it's on top, and set it at 5 millimeters. I unwrap the rest of my mummy. Now the reed shouldn't fall apart at this stage because I've got that wire already in place, so I can unwrap the rest of it. Get my wire, my thread ready for the next blank. And then I put my second wire on facing the opposite direction of the bottom so that we balance out those forces. I put my second wire at 18 millimeters. Repeat the process. It should also be where that scoring ended. Remember, 1/3 out to one side, 2/3 out to the other. Long wire on top. Long wire still on top. Just twist it once with my fingers to get it in place, and then I grab the twist, wiggle and pull. Place that second wire at 18 millimeters. We're so close, it looks like a reed. Grab my third wire, or it will be the top wire, and I place that 8 millimeters above the first. So it's 5, 18, and then 8 above 18. 1/3 off one side, 2/3 off the other. The long wire stays on top, wraps all the way around. The long wire still stays on top. You can see it's on top all the way around. And at this point, I like to have it a little bit loose and then and a little bit low and then slide it up into place so I get a really flush connection with the reed all the way up. Wiggle and pull. You notice I'm grabbing the twists and pulling the slack out so that I have a flush connection, no shadows all the way around. Just double check my measurements here. Remember, I should be 5 millimeters. Good. 18. Good. And then slide this up and 8 millimeters from the first to the second. This also works out so that if I measure from the butt end of the reed to the center of the top wire to be exactly 1 inch. So if I'm 5, 18, 8, it also adds up to be 1 inch. It's sort of my double check from 2 different schools of thought about reed wire placing. Now is when I bevel. So I'm actually going to take the blank off the mandrel. And beveling is the process of cutting off the portions of these squared edges that would overlap now that I've made it a circle. A lot of people do this at the early cane preparation stage, either with a razor blade. They'll slide this along and cut some of that extra, or they'll take a file or a piece of sandpaper and file away. I find that if I do the beveling at that stage, essentially what I'm doing is guessing where that overcut is going to be. But if I do the beveling like this, which is after it's already been formed, then I don't have to guess where it is. I just cut off the overlap. So you can see there's some points here where the 2 corners have come together and it's not quite a perfect circle. So I'm going to take where that seam is, my razor blade, slide it in the seam right into the center of the reed, and cut that extra off into the center of the tube. Slide down, cut toward the center, and it's probably hard to see on this video, but there are some little fibers of cane that were overlapping that are now trimmed off, and I just put the mandrel back in and mash the bottom part of my tube, and those get smashed into the bottom end there. It does mean that there's a little bit more of a loose fit, so I'm going to fit that to the mark on my mandrel. Tighten that third wire so it's in place, and I actually mash this with the serrated, the toothed part of the pliers, 1 plier width below, 1 plier width above, with a pretty considerable amount of force. Remember, this used to be a straight piece of wood, and now we want it to be a circle, and so the purpose of this step is actually to break the cane. So there should be marks, indentations in the cane. Pull and tug, and because I use such a quick soaking process, this cane is pretty dry. If you've ever heard a rack of reeds after it's been made, you can lean your ear down and hear the water crackling out of it. So mine don't crackle for very long. But trim my wires. I trim the third one a little bit shorter than I would trim the other 2 because it will fit underneath the wrapping. Leave the other 2 just a little bit long. And I'm just going to leave that sit and dry until the crackling stops. It can be a long time. You can leave your blanks soaking and curing like this without having been wrapped, but it does need to be to where the cane is completely dry. Otherwise, the cane will continue to shrink as the water evaporates out of it, and then your wires and your wrapping will be too loose. So at this stage, I'll leave it to dry, and then I'll have just one more video left for you about how I wrap the reed. But we have gone from gouge-shaped and profiled cane through forming the collar, scoring, folding it, made a little mummy, and I've put the wires on, and now you have a bassoon reed blank that is a perfectly round tube with a nice open throat, and it's ready to be dried.